Hi, I'm Talia Baroncelli, and you're watching theAnalysis-news. Joining me in a few minutes is Dr. Asoka Bandarage. She is the author of a recent book called Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, which speaks about debt-trapped nations and how the Bretton Woods system continues to impoverish these countries. But first, if you enjoyed this content, please consider going to our website, theAnalysis.news, and hitting the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. You can get onto our mailing list so that you're updated every time a new episode drops. And also like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, theAnalysis-news, and subscribe to the show on whichever podcast platform you're watching the show on. See you in a bit with Dr. Asoka Bandarage. I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Asoka Bandarage today. She is an adjunct professor at the California Institute for Integral Studies. She's also previously taught at the University of Brandeis and Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and held tenure at Mount Holyoke. She's published extensively on colonialism in Sri Lanka, and her most recent book is called Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World. So thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Bandarage.
Thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Your book is very timely because it speaks about the current debt crisis in Sri Lanka, but it also contextualizes this debt crisis, tying it back to the Bretton Woods system and also to European colonialism, which resulted in the impoverishment of society in Sri Lanka. And I think a lot of the colonial, or I would say mainstream portrayals of what's going on currently in Sri Lanka miss the mark, and they don't really offer the context that your book offers. And, the mainstream narratives essentially say that Sri Lanka has not been following through on its commitments to the IMF or to the World Bank, and that's why it's in this predicament. But I believe that you have a much different take on that. So why don't we begin with why you think Sri Lanka is currently in a sovereign bond and debt crisis?
Well, as you point out, the mainstream analysis is very limited. It focuses on the COVID-19 crisis, the Ukraine war and its ramifications, and local mismanagement, corruption, etc., that contributed to the emergence of this debt crisis in 2022, towards the beginning of 2022. And those are important factors, that played into the crisis. But the crisis is much more long-term. And as you pointed out, it has to be seen in global context and also historical context, which is what I try to do, to show that the colonial and neo-colonial policies, particularly neoliberal policies, have tethered countries like Sri Lanka into this debt cycle. And although they provide standby loans, they are not meant to extricate these countries from the debt burden and to make them self-sufficient and sustainable in the long term. It is more to maintain the current financial and economic system. And debt plays a very important role in that.
One thing which was really fascinating to me when I was reading your book was that you problematized this notion of debt diplomacy to China. So, a lot of think tankers will say that Sri Lanka is in debt because it's let China basically, walk all over it, and that China has invested in Sri Lanka, but as a result has been able to create a lot of debt in the country. But you actually point out that a lot of the debt is held by private asset managers such as BlackRock, and that a lot of the international sovereign bonds which Sri Lanka has are provided for by BlackRock. So could you speak about that dynamic as well, and how this sort of unregulated asset management financial system has contributed to the debt issue in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, the statistics are there, although they are not really used in the mainstream analysis correctly, that of the total foreign debt, only about 10% is owed to China, and 48% is owed to is due to private market borrowings, which is mostly international sovereign bonds, which means, and they are mostly EU and US-backed ISDs, that more than 80% of the foreign debt is used to Western creditors. And that is something, that is often overlooked.
Of course. And perhaps another thing which has been overlooked in the mainstream narrative are the agricultural reforms which were instituted in 2019. There were certain agricultural reforms which were, I believe, quite ambitious and even positive, trying to help smallholder farmers or to have a different sort of agricultural system which wasn't primarily based on the export plantation system. But would you say the portrayal of some of these reforms and how these reforms contributed to Sri Lanka not being able to make good on its debt payments is perhaps an inaccurate way of examining those reforms?
Yeah, it's a very complex issue. There was a shift to organic agriculture, which the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration had promised, but it was done very quickly overnight in order to save foreign exchange, to, not pay out for agrochemicals and pesticides that are being imported. Now, organic agriculture is no doubt the way to go, but it's not something that you can change overnight, because these small farmers, especially rice farmers, had been encouraged to shift from organic agriculture to the use of pesticides, agrochemical fertilizers over time. And they were induced to do that through the neoliberal reforms since the 1960s. And now suddenly they were told to switch back to organic agriculture overnight. And that did not work out. It sort of backfired. So that was used by certain groups to condemn organic agriculture altogether. And now they're back to, importing chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So it was a very unfortunate experience, because something that should have happened over time, got enmeshed in this whole debt crisis and debt relief issue.
Well, maybe this is a good way to speak about the history of colonialism by using this issue of agriculture. Your book speaks about how under British colonialism in the 1830s, there was a different form of agriculture which was kind of forced on the country, which was a plantation agriculture. And so a lot of the, other forms of cultivating the land by having different biodiversity and different types of crops side by side was kind of done away with. And this new form of agriculture in which, goods and certain things would be produced in order to export them to, I guess, to the UK and to other parts of Europe was implemented. And this had a terrible effect on the people who were living off the land and who were trying to enforce their customary rights by trying to live off communal land. So why don't we speak about, you don't need to speak about all the details of British colonialism, but I think this shift that took place, especially in the 1830s with this plantation economy and how that led to some of the issues that Sri Lanka is experiencing today.
Yeah, I think it should be seen in the context of the colonial experience in most countries around the world. The introduction of an import-export economy into economies and societies that were essentially self-sufficient and were focused on production of their essential food and other goods and services that they needed. Instead, with colonialism and the development or the superimposition of plantation economy and export production, the focus shifted towards these monocultural, large-scale export production, like in the case of Sri Lanka, first coffee and then tea. And this shifted the priorities. So the emphasis was on producing coffee and then tea, and then importing food, including rice. So this created this dependent model of development for a lot of global southern countries, and that trajectory has continued because the World Bank, the IMF, and the Western countries are definitely continuing to promote export production at the expense of import substitution industrialization, which many ex-colonial countries, including Sri Lanka, tried in the immediate post-colonial period. But there were a lot of obstructions from the outside, particularly the global north, against these countries from becoming self-sufficient and developing their import substitution production, particularly in the areas of food and essential needs.
I mean, would you say that there was a period, and I'm not speaking about pre-colonial periods, but I'm talking about more in the modern experience, where Sri Lanka really was able to subsist off the land? Would that have been, in the period of its independence and in the subsequent decades, or is that a bit far-fetched?
Yeah, I think this dependence deepened gradually over time. And there were periods where there were efforts to develop local agriculture, like through the Green Revolution and so on. But that led to a lot of use of, agrochemicals, pesticides, and so on, and that created other issues. But that also accompanied land commoditization, which was a process that was started under the British. In order to develop plantation agriculture, they had to introduce private property rights to land so that land became a commodity. And this was, to some extent, mitigated due to social democratic policies which were introduced starting in 1931, which are called the Donamo reforms, where there were efforts to preserve the land without being commoditized. So even today, 80% of the land is held by the state, with small farmers they have rights to the land, but they don't have outright ownership where they can sell the land. But now there is an effort to release this land to the market. And what would happen then is that many of these small farmers who are in dire economic situation would sell the land, and the land could then fall into the hands of external interests, including transnational corporations, agribusiness, for example, for export production. So part of this whole neo-colonial project, in addition to, getting control over other resources like the ports and energy and telecommunication industries, is also to get control over the land. And in the case of Sri Lanka, it is not just economic control, but because of its strategic location in the Indian Ocean, in the sea route, the east-west maritime trade route, there is a lot of competition on the part of external powers to control the country, and part of that is also control over the land.
Right, and you also speak about, the earlier forms of colonialism, of European colonialism in Sri Lanka. For example, the period in which the Portuguese were there, followed by the Dutch. But I think it was really the British who had this crown order saying that all unoccupied and uncultivated land was essentially crown lands. So it would belong to the British crown. And perhaps you could speak about how this really uprooted certain forms of being, forms of societies which were subsisting in Sri Lanka, and how that, just really destroyed their form of life.
Yeah, again, this was something that happened, around the world, because prior to the imposition of private property rights, there were hierarchical rights to land. There were class of overlords who exacted tribute from the farmers, but the local people had access to land. Land had value only when it was cultivated. So the overlord class actually encouraged people to cultivate the land. But when the British came in and introduced plantation agriculture, they needed a lot of land, and they claimed that the common land, which was open to cultivation by local producers, was crown land, and the common people were asked to produce documentation, titles to land which didn't exist, because the common land would be cultivated and let as fallow land until subsequent periods of cultivation. So there was a huge conflicts over land between the British and private interests and the local cultivator class. And I discussed this much more in detail in my first book, Colonialism in Sri Lanka. And the instruments, the legal instruments that were used, like what was called the Crown Land Ordinance of 1848, and then subsequently the Wasteland Ordinance of 1897, because the land that was not cultivated was classified as wasteland that belonged to the Crown, which simply was not the conceptualization of land in the pre-colonial period. And in a sense, that project that was started under colonialism still continues with new developments like the so-called MCC, the Millennium Challenge Cooperation Pact, that was introduced to Sri Lanka, recently, although it was not signed. Many of the objectives of that, like land commoditization, opening the land market, is continuing, and this could lead to displacement of local people from the land. With the rise of agribusiness and control of land by transnational corporations and some local interests.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the Donoughmore Commission and the Donoughmore Reforms of 1931. They were instituted by Sidney Webb, who was the UK Labour Secretary. And from what I read in your book, they were able to create a system of universal suffrage so that people could vote, and also essentially transferred some of the power from the British colonialists to local representatives. So created a sort of, I guess, local state council, if you will. How did this address some of the land issues and issues of people being expropriated from the land and not being able to assert their customary rights to the land?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you have to see the Donoughmore reforms of 1931 in the context of the Great Depression at the time, which led to both the United States, the UK, and other governments introducing more social democratic policies, out of absolute need. A more benevolent form of capitalism was, put in place. And some of that had their ramifications in the colonies as well, because the Donoughmore commissioners appointed by Sidney Webb had more social democratic leanings. So when they introduced local self-government, along with the franchise, it empowered the majority of the populace, which had no rights to vote or any representation prior to that. So with the franchise, universal suffrage, the local elites had to meet some of the needs of people in order to get their vote. And that led to introduction of a system of free education, a system of free healthcare, which in the long term led to high quality of life index in Sri Lanka, making Sri Lanka a very unique place in the world, especially in South Asia, in terms of standards of living, high literacy, low infant mortality, low maternal mortality. So although economic growth rate was low, in terms of the standard of living, Sri Lanka occupied an enviable position. In fact, I give the statistics in my book, had higher PQLI, physical quality of life indices, than even China or India or some of the other Southern Asian countries. And that these are now being attacked by the expansion of neoliberal policies. But just one more point with regard to land issues, going back to the Donomo reforms, one important piece of legislation that was introduced was the Land Development Ordinance of 1935, which gave access to land to producers, but without full ownership right, not outright ownership, but access to land for cultivation. And that sort of empowered the producer class. And again, that is under attack now with the attempt to commoditize land, which would take the land away from their hands.
Why don't we speak about rebellion and independence in Sri Lanka? I don't think the West was so happy with that movement, and neither was the United States. I mean, you speak about how John Foster Dulles, who was he U.S. Secretary at the time, State Secretary? I think, there are some documents that illustrate that the U.S. was potentially looking at overthrowing some of the ruling elite in Sri Lanka because they were opposed to their, I guess, more communist and nationalist leanings. So why don't we talk about the influence of the United States in the sort of early years of Sri Lankan independence, and in particular, there was an official from the central bank who was appointed to also run the central bank of Sri Lanka.
Right. It's a very interesting history that is really not part of the mainstream discussion or discourse. And I have a whole chapter looking at the transition from the classical period of classical colonialism to post-independence period. And that was a very vibrant period around the world where the ex-colonial countries were trying to decolonize and move on paths of their own, development paths of their own. Like, for example, African countries experimented with African socialism, like Ujamaa in Tanzania. Latin American countries experimented with import substitution. There was a lot of nationalization, like, for example, the Suez Canal in Egypt. And in Sri Lanka, too, there were a lot of efforts to decolonize and go on an independent trajectory of its own. But with the demise of British imperialism, the United States sort of emerged as the primary dominant political and economic power. And from the very beginning of Sri Lanka's independence, the United States was involved in Sri Lanka, both politically and economically. And as you pointed out, one was the Central Bank of Ceylon, as it was called then, was not only first headed by an American, he was also the founder of it and was very much involved in advising the government about internal issues like growing political discontent and, when to hold elections, so forth. And also there was election interference. There was also, because the Cold War was happening and the United States and the West was trying to prevent a lot of ex-colonial countries from joining what they saw as the communist bloc, even when these countries were not necessarily trying to join the communist bloc, but they were trying to forge their own paths of development. Like in Sri Lanka, it was called the middle path, more influenced by Buddhism. But it was perceived as a threat to Western dominance. And there was also, to some extent, Soviet involvement, but it was much more US and Western involvement.
Right, and the election interference you're speaking about, I think it was in 1956, and part of it was because of the opposition to an agreement that was reached between, I guess, I don't know if you would still call it Sri Lanka or Ceylon at the time, but...
It was Ceylon at the time.
It was Ceylon at the time, okay. So between Ceylon and China, in which Ceylon would sell rice to China below the market price, and then in return they would charge a much higher rate for rubber. And so that was a way in which they could perhaps fund some of their own infrastructure developments. And I think a lot of Western countries, especially the United States, saw that as a threat, saw that as Ceylon moving closer towards China, and that would disrupt its own hegemonic rule over Ceylon.
Right. And that was like 1952. And but the Rubber Rice Pact was considered, one of the best pacts that Sri Lanka had signed, which was advantageous to Sri Lanka. Yes. So, however, because of Western pressure and so on, Sri Lanka did not have diplomatic relations with China until much later.
Well, why don't we speak about the 1950s and 60s leading into the 70s? Because my impression is that the party that was in power, the party which gained power in this landslide victory in 1956, was not the nationalist, the UNP party supported by the US, but was more of a nationalist socialist, not in the Nazi sense, of course, but more of, having affinities to, I guess, Leninist views, or at least into nationalist views of developing the country in a way which would be equitable for all of the people living in the country, and to have, workers' rights and unions. But then there was a massive shift in 1977 and 1978 in which Sri Lanka came into its own, so to speak, with a new constitution. But that was the period in which neoliberalism was really enshrined in the system. It was kind of baked into the system in the late 70s. And I think a lot of the debt issues that Sri Lanka currently is experiencing can be tied back to 1978. So why don't we speak about what happened then, how the political system changed, and how this, shackling of Sri Lanka to this international economic system in which inequalities were basically exacerbated was really put into place then.
Yeah, you put it very well. In the 60s and 70s, Sri Lanka, along with, other ex-colonial countries, really tried to extricate themselves from this colonial pattern of development, which subordinated these countries, and where the colonial import-export economy was continued. And there were sort of valiant efforts, not only with regard to creating a new international economic order, but also a non-aligned political movement where these countries could develop on their own paths without belonging to either the West or the communist models, like during the Cold War. And in Sri Lanka in particular, Sri Lanka played an important role in all these efforts. Although a small country, it had a very dynamic leaders who were instrumental in the non-aligned movement moving forward, as well as the new international economic order throughout the United Nations Commission on Trade and Development, and also to keep the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace, and without Sri Lanka getting enmeshed in superpower struggles. So it was a time of hope, and for both Sri Lanka and the world, for these ex-colonial countries to develop on their own paths. But it was resisted, particularly by the West, and with certain amount of sort of internal mismanagement and corruption and all that, some of the programs towards, for example, nationalization of foreign-owned plantations and some import substitution programs face difficulties, not only because of internal mismanagement and corruption, but also because there were a lot of external pressures against them. So that's when, with external support, there was this shift towards a neoliberal model and a complete full-scale acceptance of the open economy. As I quoted, the president of the time said, let the robber barons come, and it was called the open economy. It was just thrown open to anyone, any force that could come and reap profit. And so gradually, the welfare state that had been begun under Donamo reforms began to be whittled away, and privatization of the plantations again started, and also in privatization of the energy and telecommunication industries, so on and so forth. So this has continued from 1977 to date, but with the economic crisis, there's an intensification of the neoliberal model, and with in concurrence with geopolitical rivalry over Sri Lanka. So it's not just the economic crisis, but it is also the geopolitical rivalry and what has been referred to as a new Cold War that has played into essentially a takeover of Sri Lanka. Because if you look at what's happening now, the ports are owned by three external powers. The Hambantota port by the Chinese, the Trincomalee, the natural harbor, essentially controlled by the Indians, and then also Colombo by India, China, and I think also Japan owns a terminal. And then telecommunications, energy corporations are being privatized, including the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, which was created in 1961 when the left nationalist government nationalized the foreign-owned petroleum corporations at that time, Caltex, Esso, and so on, and created the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, which is now being privatized again.
And what about the private foreign investments that have been conducted in Sri Lanka? Did a lot of them also start around that same time period in the late 70s? And would you say that a lot of the current financial policy is in a way to secure sort of rights of these private investors to ensure that there's stability in the country so that their investments are protected?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that prevails over the rights of workers and local people. And if you look at even, say, the tourism sector, which was one of the major sectors of the export production model, there haven't been enough studies on that, who really benefits from tourism. Like in many sectors involved in neoliberal export production, a lot of the profits go outside of the country. And I have lots of figures on the drain of resources, not just from Sri Lanka, but from the so-called global south, and the net transfer of resources and wealth from the global south to the global north rather than the other way around. Like, I think between 2018 and 2017, as I point out in my book, there was a 4 trillion transfer in terms of debt interest alone from the global south to the global north. And, Sri Lanka has been very much enmeshed in this. And what is often forgotten is that a lot of the foreign exchange that the countries earned during the period since 1977 has been from worker remittances. That is, ordinary people who are going to work in the Middle East and sending their remittances to the country, which has become the number one form of foreign exchange earnings, even during the crisis, while the elite, including import-exporters in Sri Lanka, have, through tax loopholes, stashed their money in outside of the country, some 38 to 50 billion. It is the ordinary workers working in the Middle East, including women domestic workers, who have been sending money, remittances to the country and also helping maintain their families. And another sector is the manufacturing sector, the garment export sector, which was, promoted, with the neoliberal reforms, and Sri Lanka became a big garment exporter. And I have a lot of information about that sector also. It's been very tightly controlled. The worker rights have been really slashed, and the wages are very low. And, there's in each of these sectors, whether it is the continuing plantation sector, the garment sector, the labor export, the tourism sector, the local people, the labor rights have been slashed, and their earnings also have gone down with economic downturns, like, during the COVID crisis, for example.
Well, we were speaking about the fact that a lot of workers in Sri Lanka have been forced to leave the country to work in other countries and to send remittances back home. But one thing you point out in the book is how the same European colonialists who were running the Atlantic slave trade were also importing a labor force into Sri Lanka in, I guess, the 1800s. Like hundreds and thousands of people, like a Tamil workforce, was being imported. But now it's kind of the opposite as to what's going on right now, where people are forced to leave because they can't make a living in Sri Lanka. But why don't we shift now to the issue of climate? Because Sri Lanka, because of its geographical location and its huge, massive coast, there's been so much coastal erosion, and I think it's unfortunately very vulnerable to flooding and to other environmental catastrophes, and just global climate catastrophe in general has had a really horrible effect on it. So what do you think needs to be done in order to assist Sri Lanka? Should there be reparations? Should there be institution of loss and damage? This is something that was talked about in some of the recent IPCC climate conventions, where loss and damage is an issue. A lot of global South countries are speaking about this and demanding that, money be paid out toward them in the form of reparations so that they could better deal with climate catastrophes, since they're much more vulnerable to a lot of these climate catastrophes.
Yeah. These again need to be, because we cannot separate the environment issue from the issue of protecting people and societies. So we have to have both the ecological and social welfare approach, that are simultaneously addressed. And some of the discussions around debt for nature swaps for the global South need to be really examined much more closely, because a country that is debt-ridden like Sri Lanka could be asked to protect its forests in a debt for nature swap. And on the face of it, it's well and good, but we have to also remember that people's livelihoods are important, and that the onus of protecting the forests and the environment should not be placed on the global South alone, when in fact countries like Sri Lanka have had a minuscule carbon footprint. Their carbon emissions have been minuscule compared to the emissions of the dominant countries, the global North, the US, Europe, China, and so on. So I think we have to have more of a climate justice approach, where the climate issue and the survival of people are addressed together. And also,
sorry to interrupt you, but what is the debt for nature swap that you're speaking about? Could you explain what that is, as well as some of the mechanisms tied to it?
Yeah, I don't know too much about it, but that's been talked about, that in order to address the global climate issue, one approach could be that the debt of some of the global southern countries be cancelled if they agreed to protect natural resources, particularly forests. And on the face of it, it's a good idea, but some local people themselves, not just in Sri Lanka, but around the world, have been questioning that should that be at the expense of survival of local people who depend on forest resources and to some extent forest development. So that's why it has to be a much more balanced approach. I'm not saying that forest protection is not important. It's extremely important in a place like Sri Lanka, where the deforestation has been immense starting in the colonial period, mostly starting with plantation development. But at the same time, there's also population pressure and the need to for resources for people's livelihood. So I think it has to be a more balanced approach. It's not approach that is anti-technology or anti-development, but a more balanced approach. And there are many organizations and networks that are talking about localization and not just export production, but putting self-sufficiently and local economic autonomy and survival of planet and people's livelihoods before profit making, which continues to be the dominant criterion despite the environmental destruction and massive social destruction that is going on.
And how would you assess the environmentalist movement within Sri Lanka itself? There were protests, for example, in 2022 against the prime minister at the time, but would you say that they were really influenced by this, ecological consciousness that climate change is something that's, a huge issue in Sri Lanka and the world and in the rest of the global south, and this, awareness of neoliberalism and how it's exacerbating the debt issues in Sri Lanka, or was that not part of the whatsoever?
Yeah, I think not enough. I mean, there have been, environmental organizations and networks fighting a number of these neoliberal and externally funded projects, like including the Chinese port city, the Hambantota city, the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact, so on and so forth. But if you look at the Aragalaya protest movement, which emerged in response to the massive economic crisis and the ouster of the previous Rajapaksa regime, there was not sufficient. They called for system change, but for them, the system change was the removal of the then president and the prime minister, rather than an understanding or a deeper exploration of the roots of the crisis in the global economic and financial system. And also there was really a lack of an understanding of the environmental dimensions of the issue. So I think, both in Sri Lanka and the world, we have to put the environment first and people as part of the environment before profit and the whole domination paradigm, if you will, which is what is being pursued in spite of this this ecological and social collapse that is going on in Sri Lanka and the world, and essentially this kind of a takeover of a country, which had very high quality of life, and now becoming a really impoverished country where, country which had a fine education and free healthcare system. Now some of the hospitals don't even have a single anesthesiologist because the doctors are leaving, professional classes are leaving. It is a real tragedy to see this country, which was an exemplary country in terms of the standards of living in the global south, becoming an indebted, impoverished country, and people are in such a desperate situation that there is not much voicing of alternative perspectives. And that's why I think sort of talking about Sri Lanka in the global context and in the international arena is really important to bring these issues before the global audience.
How would you assess Sri Lanka's role geopolitically? It's been neutral for many decades, but would you say that it's kind of in with the BRICS, so to speak, that it's maybe seeing its future together with countries like Brazil, India, China, and Russia, since the Bretton Woods system has only really continued its impoverishment?
Yeah, many presidents in Sri Lanka, even recently, have declared a neutral policy for Sri Lanka. But because of the intense geopolitical rivalry over Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka has become sort of subordinate to several masters instead of one. There's so much pressure. And instead of using this strategic position to its advantage to get what is needed for the country and its people, it's become sort of dependent and servile and meeting the interests of several foreign powers, for example, China, the United States and the West, and India, which is an increasingly dominant player in the Sri Lankan case. So this is, is not a new situation. As I point out, Sri Lanka has had the longest history of European colonialism in Asia, starting in 1505. And there have been battles over the Trincomalee Harbor among various foreign powers. And so the strategic location and the natural resources and of the country without benefiting the people has also brought a lot of external interventions, which are not necessarily, good for the country. And of course, the local collaborative class has been, is implicated in this as well, because without local collaboration, neither classical colonialism or the neocolonialism of today could continue.
And one last very, very short question before you go. I think it's maybe nice to end on a positive note. Your book speaks about ecological alternatives. And so perhaps you could sum up what you meant by partnership. I mean, you've alluded to this throughout the conversation, but you speak about partnership as being a way forward of ensuring that there's respect for the land, respect for people's rights, respect for workers. So perhaps you could speak about that concept of partnership and how that maybe provides a way out of the debt and climate crisis for Sri Lanka.
Right. A lot of the language of partnership, democracy, human rights have been appropriated and misused. But partnership ultimately is about partnership with nature and having a different consciousness. I talk about transformation of consciousness because the dominant economic model, even the model that seems to be pursued by the BRICS countries, although they are presented as an alternative, is one pursuing the same goals of domination, profit, and power. And I think instead of that, we need one where we honor the needs for social justice and environmental sustainability, which requires us to live with nature. And instead of an approach of domination over nature, how we develop ways of living in harmony with nature. And I think there's a lot of research and networks, working towards that. And, for example, localization efforts, where bioregionalism, agroecology are developed over agribusiness and export agriculture, for example. And transition movement, which talks about renewable sources of energy and organic agriculture instead of, chemical fertilizer, pesticides, so on. So there are efforts in Sri Lanka as well, but I think it has to be part of a global effort because Sri Lanka is not an isolated island. It's very much a part of the global economic, political system, and ecosystem. So I think, there's got to be more consciousness that the crisis in Sri Lanka or Zambia or some other indebted country is not just an isolated one, which is the way it is approached. Rather to see this as part of a systemic problem, and that we need this systemic change, which means, really questioning the dominant model driven by profit and domination towards something, that upholds harmony and interdependence, which means ultimately people and social movements, working together to bring that transformation of consciousness and putting that into policy.
Well, I think you made an excellent point by saying that the approach of the BRICS is not really an alternative because it essentially pursues the same capitalist profit making, and that's not something that can help the world get out of the current climate catastrophe in which it faces itself. And a real alternative would be something which is inherently anti-capitalist and which is distributive and also respectful of the world and the climate and people which inhabit this planet. So, Dr. Bandarage, it was really great speaking with you today. Thank you for taking the time, and I highly recommend your book, Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, for anyone is interested in the legacy of colonialism and how these issues continue to impact countries in the global south struggling with debt. And I hope to have you on again in the future. And thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. If you enjoyed this content, please consider donating to the show by going to theAnalysis.news and hitting the red button at the top right corner of the screen. Get onto our mailing list and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you watch the show. You can also go to our YouTube channel, theAnalysis-news, and like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much again, Dr. Bandarage. It was great to have you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Atalia.